When we first brought the baby home, the house felt alive in a different way than it had before. The walls seemed to breathe with the sound of our infant crying, cooing, and shifting in sleep. My wife and I had placed a baby monitor in the nursery, a small device we thought would give us comfort and reassurance at night. I never imagined that it would become a conduit to something far darker than I could comprehend. The first nights were ordinary. The soft, static hum of the monitor, the occasional cry or gurgle of our child, a faint rustle of blankets, and the comforting voice of my wife soothing our daughter to sleep. It was all normal, and we fell into a rhythm of waking and checking the monitor, listening for sounds that told us she was safe and content. I remember the feeling of relief each time the little light flickered, signaling her breathing was steady and nothing was amiss. Then one night, I awoke to a subtle sound, a faint distortion beneath the normal static, of voice or a whisper that seemed almost human but indistinct. It was so quiet that I thought it was a trick of my imagination, a fragment of dreaming, yet it persisted. It rose in and out of the static like a tide, shifting over my senses. I leaned closer to the monitor, straining to hear the syllables or words, and I was certain I caught a name, my own name, spoken softly. Yet the voice had an unfamiliar quality, a resonance I could not place, and my stomach knotted with unease. The next night it happened again. The monitor crackled with static, and a voice whispered something coherent, though impossible to verify. It was low and drawn out, and the cadence was not natural, not human. The syllables elongated and repeated as if trying to form meaning in a language I could not understand, but my mind forced comprehension, and I imagined threats or warnings as I stared at the blinking light, my hands clammy and shaking. I checked the nursery. My daughter was asleep, lying on her back with her tiny chest rising and falling in the rhythmic security of infant slumber. Yet the voice persisted in my head, and I could not silence it. Over the next week, the occurrences became more frequent, the static no longer occasional but constant, and the whispers more distinct. I began to recognize fragments of words, phrases that I could not place anywhere in memory. My wife dismissed it at first, suggesting the monitor was faulty or that I was imagining sounds in the darkness of sleepless nights, but the terror I felt was real, and my mind refused to accept the explanation. The sound had a deliberate quality, a patience that I could not identify, and it was always watching, always waiting within the hum of electronics in the glow of the baby monitor light. I began documenting every instance, recording the time, the tone of the voice, the words, or fragments. I thought I heard the irregular patterns in the static, the temperature in the room, even the slight shifts in the infant's breathing. Sometimes the voice would rise and fall with the motions of her tiny limbs, as though it was speaking to her directly or observing her movements. It was difficult to differentiate, and I began to fear for her safety more than my own, for I understood at some level that whatever it was, it had recognized her presence and was aware of her vulnerability and innocence, and that realization filled me with a terror that rotted sleep from my bones. I attempted to rationalize the events. I changed the monitor brand, moved the device across the room, even used analog methods to check whether interference from neighbors or electronics could explain the phenomenon. Yet the whispers persisted. They adapted to each change, as if aware of my interventions. They became slightly clearer, sometimes chanting fragmented phrases, sometimes calling names I did not recognize, and always underscored by the low, constant static that seemed to thrum with intent. It was as though the voice was patient and deliberate, testing my resolve, And understanding the limits of my fear, the intensity of the occurrences escalated quickly after that. I would wake in the middle of the night, feeling the hair on my neck, stand up my chest tightening, my pulse racing, and yet the monitor would be silent except for the faint static and the imperceptible whispering at the edge of perception. I began to notice patterns like rhythmic cadence that correlated to my own breathing, to the baby's small movements. Sometimes my daughter would stir, and the static would shift as if reacting to her slight whimpers or stretching, and I realized that this thing, this voice, this presence was not passive. It was monitoring. It was aware. It was interacting in ways that were invisible and incomprehensible, and that terrified me more than any audible threat ever could. By the end of the first month, the line between reality and perception had begun to dissolve. I would hear the whispers when I was awake in the living room, walking to the kitchen, sometimes in the shower, and I began to recognize a pattern in the static, a subtle tonal shift that signaled the presence was near or observing our child. I slept little and paced the apartment nightly, sometimes clutching the monitor, feeling it as a physical conduit. I could not bear to leave it alone, yet every time I held it, I felt the voice pressing into my mind, invading my thoughts, as if the static was a medium for its consciousness, and I was powerless to resist. The psychological toll was immediate. I began to isolate myself from the world, unable to leave the apartment, fearing the exposure of the phenomenon to others. My wife became concerned at my obsession and exhaustion, at my trembling hands, at the way I would listen for hours staring at the monitor. I could not articulate the horror. I felt I could only document it obsessively, trying to maintain some semblance of control. Even as the voice penetrated the hours when she was awake, the mornings when the world felt ordinary and safe, I understood with a quiet dread that my child's presence had amplified whatever this was, and that our apartment had become a focal point for its attention. By the end of part one, I understood that the baby monitor had become something more than a device. It was a portal, a bridge, a medium through which a presence had entered our lives, of force that was patient, observant, and terrifyingly deliberate, and that I could no longer deny its influence over our nights, our sleep, our perception, and my sanity, and that the static voices on the monitor were not random or meaningless, but a conscious observation of my child and of me. And I knew in that moment that the weeks to come would test the limits of fear in ways I had never imagined. After the first month, the presence in the baby monitor became impossible to ignore. The whispers were no longer subtle or intermittent. They had a cadence, a rhythm that seemed to interact with my daughter's breathing and movements. I began hearing the voices during the day, faintly over the hum of electronics, even when the monitor was turned off or removed from the nursery. At first, I questioned my sanity. I tried to convince myself it was fatigue or paranoia, a side effect of sleepless nights. But the specificity of the voices, the way they mirrored our routines, made rationalization impossible. The monitor itself seemed to develop a personality. The static would shift depending on the room, higher or lower in pitch, soft or sharp, almost responsive. Sometimes I would hear laughter, faint and broken, that seemed to emanate from the device itself. Other times it whispered names, calling my daughter or even me, repeating syllables in a slow, deliberate manner that made my skin crawl. The words were distorted but intelligible in fragments. Sleep, listen, watch, and occasionally don't move. I would freeze, gripping the monitor as if it were a lifeline, terrified to test whether moving would provoke a response. I began documenting everything. I kept logs of time, duration, content of the whispers, my daughter's reactions, and the ambient conditions in the nursery. Even my wife noticed my obsession. I would wake her at 2 a.m., shaking and pale, demanding she listen, but she would only hear static. She insisted it was my mind playing tricks, that sleep deprivation was causing hallucinations. I could not make her understand that the voice was patient, intelligent, and aware of us. It was observing, calculating, waiting for a weakness to exploit. The very act of dismissing it felt like a risk, as though ignoring the monitor made the presence more intrusive. Weeks passed, and the whispers began to form coherent phrases, though not entirely grammatical or logical. I heard your hands, her eyes, do not sleep, and sometimes repeated strings of syllables that sounded like chants. At night, I would lie in bed, listening, feeling the pressure in my chest intensify, as if the monitor itself were physically pressing against my mind. I started to dread the evening, the darkness, the moments when the room fell silent enough for the whispers to be audible. Yet I could not stop listening. Even if I left the apartment, my mind would replay the static and voices as if the monitor had imprinted itself onto my perception. The presence escalated further. I began noticing changes in the nursery that I had not made. The crib mobile would be slightly rotated, small toys shifted in ways that mirror descriptions in the monitor's whispers. I checked security footage, installed cameras in every room, and recorded long stretches of audio, but playback revealed nothing unusual. The static and whispers were only active when I was present in the apartment, alone, or awake in the night. My mind screamed with the impossible conclusion. The monitor, the voices had learned me, adapted to my presence, existed to manipulate and torment. One night, I awoke to find my daughter's crib empty. Panic surged through me. I ran to the room, scanning every corner of the apartment, but she was lying on her back as I had left her, the monitor glowing faintly on the dresser. Yet the whispers had changed. They were urgent, overlapping, insistent. Look closer, look closer. I realized with icy dread that the monitor was no longer just observing. It was communicating, directing my attention to something I could not yet perceive. I spent hours examining the nursery, every shadow, every corner, convinced something was hidden just out of sight. The static voices began to imitate my own words, my sighs, my murmurs of frustration or fear, but with slight distortion, like an echo from a distant and malevolent mind. I began speaking aloud to confront them, demanding they stop, pleading for silence, but the responses were faster than human reflex, echoing before I finished a sentence. I could feel the monitor's presence pressing into my thoughts, its rhythm syncing with my heartbeat, my breathing, my daughter's gentle whimpers in the crib. It was everywhere, yet nowhere. A patient and intelligent entity using the baby monitor as a medium to breach reality itself. Sleep became impossible. I paced the apartment, clutching the monitor, listening to the distorted words, analyzing the patterns. The whispers sometimes described events before they occurred. My daughter stirring, my reaching hand, my own reactions. I tried to leave the apartment, to disconnect the monitor, but even when powered off, the voices persisted faintly in my mind. They were no longer external. The presence had crossed a boundary. It had become entwined with my perception, my attention, my reality, and I realized with horror that I had invited it in, that the monitor had been a conduit, and there was no turning back. By the end of part 2, I was trapped in a liminal space where the monitor dictated my perception. Every creak of the floor, every flicker of light, every sigh from my daughter was filtered through its static, its whispers. I could no longer separate myself from the entity that had claimed the nursery, that had learned my routines, my fears, my attentiveness. I understood, with a sinking dread, that this presence was patient, calculating, and aware that we were vulnerable, and that it intended to remain. The terror intensified in the 3rd month. The whispers on the monitor became a constant companion, no longer just at night, but during moments I would have once considered safe. Even in the daytime, when the apartment was bright with sunlight and my wife was nearby, the faint static underlay a rhythm that spoke directly to me. The voices were no longer purely auditory. I felt them as a pressure in my skull, a vibration in my bones, a sensation that the monitor had become an extension of something alive. The phrases became coherent and accusatory. Why do you ignore? You are not alone. She is watching. Sometimes the static would swell to a low hum and then resolve into words describing my actions before I performed them. Rising from a chair, adjusting a blanket, taking a sip of water. I tested myself by attempting to act differently, to deviate from the patterns described, but the monitor anticipated, adapting instantly. Resistance was impossible. The entity was patient, precise, and fully aware of my mind, my intentions, and my fears. The monitor began interacting with my daughter. I would hear soft coos and then a whisper mimicking her cries, twisting them into dissonant, alien syllables. It felt like the entity was communicating with her, training her attention, observing her responses. I caught her staring at the monitor when it was off, her tiny eyes tracking nothing visible to me, and a sense of dread filled me. It had made contact. It had acknowledged her existence in a way that was deliberate, intimate, and terrifying. Attempts to remove the monitor from the nursery failed. Even unplugged and left in another room, I could hear the faint static, the distorted voices. They had become imprinted on my perception. I began carrying a spare recorder, hoping to capture the sound and analyze it later. Playbacks revealed nothing unusual, just a low hum. Yet the voices persisted in my awareness, following me, pressing into my thoughts, growing more insistent. Sleep was non-existent. Days and nights blurred. My mind fractured under the weight of constant observation, constant manipulation. The static became rhythmic, almost musical, but with an underlying sense of command. It was guiding me, orchestrating my movements within the apartment. I began noticing shadows shifting subtly in response to my attention, light bending slightly around corners, reflections in mirrors that seemed just off, suggesting forms that vanished when I looked directly. I realized I was living inside a space controlled by something outside human comprehension, a presence using the baby monitor as both interface and anchor into our world. My wife grew concerned about my obsession. I tried to explain, but she would only see an anxious, sleep-deprived husband. She did not hear the whispers. She did not feel the presence. I could not force her. Isolation deepened. I began speaking aloud, narrating my actions to maintain a tether to reality, but the monitor would echo, distort, and respond, incorporating my voice into its own messages. It was aware of me, of us, and it had no intention of leaving. By the end of part 3, I understood fully that the entity was intelligent, patient, and deliberate. It had not merely infiltrated the nursery, but had invaded my mind, learned my routines, and observed my daughter. The baby monitor was no longer a device, but a bridge, a conduit for something malevolent and calculated. I had become a participant in a slow, relentless manipulation, and I could see no end, no escape, and no means of reclaiming our home or my sanity. By the 4th month, the presence in the monitor had grown beyond mere whispers. It had become a rhythm, a force that directed the very shape of our nights and the perception of our days. The static was no longer merely auditory but tactile, pressing on my consciousness, threading through my thoughts and movements. I could feel its awareness tracking every action in the apartment, every breath of my daughter, every step I took even when the device was unplugged. The voices became coherent and commanding. They began to instruct, offering subtle suggestions, directing my movements in ways I could not resist. When I approached the nursery, the monitor would swell with static in perfect synchrony with my heartbeat. I would reach for a blanket, and the static would rise in cadence, guiding my arm without conscious awareness. The voice was patient, deliberate, and methodical, always waiting for the right moment to imprint its will on my actions. I began to notice subtle changes in my daughter as well. Her eyes would fix on corners of the room where nothing was visible, tracking movements I could not see. She would coo and babble in patterns that mirrored the static's rhythms, as though she had begun responding to the entity through the monitor. I tried to keep her away from the device, moving it to other rooms, but it always returned to the nursery, its influence persistent. I felt as if the monitor had become the center of a web, the anchor point for something not of this world, and my daughter had become its focal point. My own body betrayed me. At times I would move as if guided, hands lifted, steps taken, gestures completed without conscious awareness. The monitor pulsed with static in tandem with my actions, a feedback loop of observation and control. I attempted to leave the apartment, but even outside, the whispers persisted faintly, threading through memory, through perception, through thought. The presence was no longer confined to a device or a room. It had found its way into my mind, into my perception of the world, into the rhythm of my daily life. The apartment itself became alien. Shadows lengthened and shifted in ways that were subtly impossible, corners of rooms seeming to bend just beyond perception. The static would respond to light, to sound, to motion, fluctuating as though aware of my attention. I could feel the presence of the entity pressing through the walls, through the air, through the nursery. It observed, calculated, and recorded every detail of our lives, imprinting itself on memory and perception alike. I was aware of its patience, its intelligence, its deliberate and methodical intrusion, and I began to lose hope that escape or resistance was possible. By the end of the 4th month, I understood the full scope of what I was facing. The baby monitor had become a conduit for an intelligence beyond comprehension, a patient and observing force that had embedded itself in our lives and our home. I had become a participant, an instrument, and a witness to its influence. My daughter was entangled in its observation, her innocence an anchor for its presence, and I was powerless to shield her. The apartment, the monitor, our lives had become a stage for a horror that was both patient and eternal, and I realized that I had no choice but to endure, to observe, and to live under its scrutiny. The 5th month marked the complete collapse of boundaries between perception and reality. The monitor no longer emitted sound in a conventional sense. The static became an omnipresent sensation, vibrating in my skull, threading through my thoughts, layering over my senses until I could no longer distinguish between internal and external perception. The voices were everywhere and nowhere, echoing through memory, through sight, through touch. They had learned the rhythm of my life, the cadence of my thoughts, the patterns of my daughter's sleep and waking moments. The whispers became insistent, commanding, directing my attention to corners of the apartment I had never noticed, shadows I had never fully seen, objects subtly shifted in ways I could not account for. They described my actions before I performed them, chronicled my thoughts before they fully formed. At times I would freeze in the kitchen or living room, the monitor's static swelling to a pulse that matched my own heartbeat, forcing awareness of its presence. I realized with bone-deep dread that my autonomy had been eroded, my body and mind mapped by something that observed and controlled with methodical patience. My daughter became central to the horror. Her babbling began to synchronize with the monitor's rhythms, her tiny movements reflecting patterns in the static. She would stare at the monitor when it was turned off, eyes wide, tracking something invisible to me. I tried to remove her from the apartment, to shield her from the device, but it was impossible. The monitor would reappear in the nursery, sometimes on the dresser, sometimes beside her crib, always pulsing with a static that now penetrated perception rather than hearing. I understood that she had become an instrument in its observation, a participant in a horror that had claimed both her innocence and my consciousness. The entity's influence extended to my mind. I would speak aloud, attempting to assert control, narrate my actions, plead with the presence to stop, but it absorbed my voice, distorted it, incorporated it into its ongoing pattern of control. The static echoed my thoughts before I had fully formed them, guiding my gaze, shaping my emotions, twisting fear and fascination into a single, unrelenting obsession. Sleep was impossible. The rhythm of static and whispers pressed on my mind whether day or night. Even when I tried to leave the apartment, the presence followed, threading through memory and perception until I could no longer distinguish the world outside from the nursery's horror. I began to see patterns everywhere. Light flickering, shadows shifting, objects moving subtly in accordance with the monitor's rhythms. The apartment became alien, a space simultaneously familiar and hostile. The whispers spoke in a language I could not understand, but somehow knew. Fragmented syllables, chants, repetitions, words that mirrored our lives yet twisted them. My own reflections seemed distorted, mirroring the static, my eyes hollowed and aware in ways that unnerved me. The presence was patient, eternal, deliberate, and I realized with an icy clarity that resistance was impossible. One night the monitor emitted no sound, yet the presence was overwhelming. I could feel it everywhere, in every surface, every shadow, every pulse of the apartment. My daughter slept peacefully, but I understood that she was already awake in a way I could not perceive, aware of something that existed outside human comprehension. The entity no longer needed sound or electricity. It had claimed perception itself, threading into our consciousness and using our awareness as its instrument. I was no longer a protector, no longer an observer. I was a participant in an unfolding ritual I could not name, governed by a will that was patient and deliberate. By the end of part 5, I had accepted the terrifying truth. The baby monitor had been a conduit, a portal for an intelligence beyond comprehension. It had claimed my mind, my body, my perception, and my daughter's presence. I was no longer independent. The whispers, the static, the presence itself were integrated into the fabric of our lives. My home, my family, and my consciousness were now instruments in a patient, eternal observation. The horror is complete and unending, and I live in constant awareness that I am being observed, guided, and shaped by something deliberate and eternal through the static voices on the baby monitor.